The sound of shattering glass cut through the marble corridors of the Vasiliev estate like a gunshot, but the person bleeding wasn't the one anyone expected. A heavy-set house cleaner named Rosie Callahan had just thrown her 260-pound body between a silver letter opener and the frail chest of the most dangerous man's only son. What came after wasn't just gratitude. It was a complete and total reckoning. Rosie Callahan did not belong in a place like this. She knew it the moment she first walked through the service entrance of the Vasiliev estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, lugging her industrial cleaning caddy past a valet, who looked at her the way people look at furniture that arrived in the wrong color. She was 26 years old, 5'4", and built, as her late mother had always said with infuriating cheerfulness, like a woman who was made to last. Her thighs rubbed together under the stiff gray uniform she'd bought 2 sizes too small because the supply closet had run out of larger ones. Her dark auburn hair was perpetually escaping from its bun. She sweated through her collar by 10 in the morning. She was not graceful. She was not quiet. And in a house that ran on the twin engines of silence and perfection, Rosie Callahan was a problem. But she needed this job. Not wanted. Needed. Her younger brother Danny was 17 and diabetic, with insulin costs that didn't care about minimum wage or late shifts at the diner that had laid her off 3 weeks before. The Vasiliev estate paid triple what any normal cleaning service offered, and the non-disclosure agreement she'd signed on her first day was 12 pages long, and referenced things like proprietary household operations and discretionary incidents. Rosie had signed it anyway, in the cramped break room off the kitchen, while a stone-faced man with a holstered gun watched her from the corner. She knew what the Vasiliev name meant. Everyone in Connecticut's shadowed upper counties knew. Victor Vasiliev was 61 years old, silver-haired, and ran a network of import companies, private security firms, and real estate holdings that stretched from New Haven to the Florida coast. He paid his taxes. He attended charity galas. His lawyers were the best in the state. He was also, by every whispered account in the service industry, the quiet head of one of the oldest and most methodical criminal organizations on the eastern seaboard. Not the kind with shootouts on street corners, the kind with judges on retainer and shipping containers that customs officers were paid not to open. Rosie didn't ask questions. She cleaned. She kept her head down. She was good at both. What she had not expected on her 3rd week of employment was Mikhail. Mikhail Vasiliev was 38 years old, the only son of Victor, and completely, almost aggressively different from his father. Where Victor was silver and still, Mikhail was dark and restless. He moved through the estate like a man who had too much energy for the space he occupied. His jaw was always set. His eyes, a deep, unreadable gray, swept every room he entered with the instinct of someone who had spent his life anticipating threats. He had Victor's broad shoulders and his mother's mouth, which Rosie had noticed from the single portrait in the east hallway. A woman with soft eyes who had died when Mikhail was 12. Mikhail ran the legitimate side of the business. At least, that was what the household staff said in careful, indirect language. He handled the real estate arm, the public face, the board meetings. He was the one who shook hands with politicians. His father handled everything else. Rosie's first real interaction with him had been catastrophic. She'd been backing out of the library with a mop bucket, not looking, and had reversed directly into Mikhail's chest as he turned the corner. The bucket had tipped. Grey, soapy water had sloshed across the left leg of what she would later learn was a $4,000 suit. She had stood there, mop in hand, face burning so hot she could feel her ears waiting to be fired. Mikhail had looked down at his soaked trouser leg. Then he had looked at her. His expression hadn't been anger exactly. It had been something more unsettling, a long, assessing pause, as if he were recalibrating information. "You're new," he said. 3 weeks, she managed. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay for the cleaning I can." "Don't." He picked up the mop himself, propped it against the wall, and stepped around the puddle with the kind of economical grace that annoyed her even as she admired it. "Watch where you're going next time." That was it. No write-up. No call to the estate manager. He just walked away, one leg darker than the other. She had thought about it longer than was reasonable. The estate ran on a rigid hierarchy, and Rosie was near the bottom of it. Above her were the senior housekeepers, then the household manager, then the estate's private chef, then a rotating cast of security personnel who answered only to a man named Callum, who answered only to Mikhail, who answered only to Mikhail, who answered only to Victor. Victor himself was a presence more felt than seen. He existed in locked rooms, in hushed phone calls, in the way the entire staff seemed to collectively hold their breath when his car came down the long gravel drive. Rosie had met him once. He'd passed her in the west hallway, paused, and said, "You missed a smudge. South corner of the window." Then he'd walked on. She'd gone back and checked. There had been a smudge. She'd cleaned it. The person who actually spoke to Rosie, regularly and without any apparent awareness of the social chasm between them, was Dmitri. Dmitri Vasiliev was Victor's younger brother, 64 years old, a widower, and the most genuinely kind person in a house full of people who had weaponized courtesy. He had Victor's height but none of his coldness. He walked with a cane, following a car accident 15 years prior, and he spent most of his days in the estate's solarium, reading military history and feeding crackers to the 2 ancient cats that had belonged to his late wife. Dmitri had a condition he referred to, with careful lightness, as the fog. It was more than that. Rosie had recognized the signs within her first week. The slight disorientation when he moved between rooms, the way he sometimes called her by a different name, a woman's name, Elena, before catching himself. The evenings she'd found him standing at the solarium door, looking out at the dark garden with an expression of profound, confused loss. Her grandmother had had the same look. Early-stage dementia had a particular quality of absence to it, a temporary extinguishing of the self, before the person returned and tried to pretend they'd never been gone. Rosie had spent 2 years caring for her grandmother before the old woman passed. She knew how to handle the fog without making a person feel small in it. She started quietly reorganizing Dmitri's solarium. His medications, previously scattered across 3 different surfaces, she arranged in a labeled weekly dispenser and left it where he'd see it first thing each morning. When he called her Elena, she didn't correct him immediately. She answered gently. Then, once he'd steadied, slipped back to her own name. She found him in the garden once at dusk, disoriented, and walked him back inside through the side door without alerting the security team, talking about the cats the entire way, a topic that always seemed to anchor him. Dmitri had taken her hand one afternoon, his arthritic fingers closing around her thick wrist, and said with the complete clarity that sometimes broke through the fog-like sunlight, "You are a genuinely good person, Rosie. Don't let this place make you forget that." She'd gone to the cleaning supply room afterward and cried quietly into a stack of fresh towels. She would have done anything to protect him. She just hadn't understood yet what that would actually require. The night everything changed, the estate was hosting a private dinner for a business associate Victor had been cultivating for 2 years. His name was Conrad Hale, and he arrived in a car that cost more than most people's houses, trailed by a woman introduced as his daughter, Vivienne. Vivienne Hale was 32. Precise and beautiful in the engineered way of people who have spent significant money and discipline on their appearance. She wore a black dress and a smile that never fully reached her eyes. She moved through the estate's formal rooms with the proprietary ease of someone who had already decided these rooms belonged to her. The staff had been briefed that the dinner was significant. No one said why. They didn't need to. Rosie was assigned to service duties that evening, moving quietly through the formal dining room, refilling water glasses and removing plates between courses. She had worn her best uniform, the one without the small bleach stain at the hem, and had managed to keep her hair pinned for longer than usual. She was doing fine. She was invisible, which was the goal. It was Vivienne who broke the equilibrium. Rosie was carrying a tray of dessert plates across the dining room when Vivienne shifted her chair back without looking. The chair caught Rosie's left knee. Rosie stumbled, the tray tipping, and her elbow grazed Vivienne's shoulder as she fought to right herself. She saved the tray. Not a single plate hit the floor. Vivienne looked up at her with an expression of slow, deliberate contempt. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Vivienne said. Not quietly, The table's conversation dimmed. "I'm very sorry, Miss Hale," Rosie said, keeping her voice even. "The chair." "I don't care about the chair." Vivian's eyes moved over Rosie with the unhurried assessment of someone evaluating livestock. "I'm asking if you're capable of performing a basic function without making a spectacle of yourself, or is that genuinely beyond you?" A few of the men at the table shifted uncomfortably. Victor's expression did not change. Mikhail, seated 3 chairs down, set his fork down very quietly. Rosie said nothing. She dipped her chin, stepped back, and resumed her duties. Her face was hot. Her hands were perfectly steady. She had learned a long time ago how to keep her hands steady. Later, between courses, she slipped out to check on Dmitri. He had been seated in the adjoining sitting room, away from the formal dinner, with a small plate of food and his book. Victor had explained this as a preference. Rosie knew it was protection. The noise and the social complexity of formal dinners were exactly the kind of environment that accelerated the fog. When she reached the sitting room, it was empty. The plate was untouched. The book was on the floor. The cold spread through her chest immediately. She didn't panic, she moved. She checked the solarium first. Empty. The library. The hallway bathroom. The east sitting room. Each empty room tightened the knot behind her sternum. She was heading toward the conservatory at the back of the house, moving quickly now, when she heard voices from the study at the end of the hall. One voice was Dmitri's, confused and slightly elevated. The tone he used when the fog was thick. The other was Vivian's. Rosie slowed. She pressed herself to the wall beside the partially open door, her heart slamming. "Told you," Vivian was saying, her voice low and sharp, stripped of the performative warmth she'd worn of the table. "This arrangement is happening. Your nephew is going to finalize it. And once he does, the dynamics of this household are going to change considerably." "I don't know what you're talking about." Dmitri's voice was unsteady. "Who are you? Where is Elena?" "Elena is dead," Vivian said flatly. "And frankly, so is any relevance you have to what happens next. You're a liability, old man. Victor can't see it, but Mikhail might, once I'm in a position to point it out clearly. You'll be moved somewhere manageable. That's not a threat. That's logistics." "My brother would never." "Your brother is getting old." There was a pause, and then Rosie heard movement. "You spilled wine on me." Vivian's voice had turned to ice. "Look at that, all over my dress." "I didn't mean to, You're pathetic." Through the gap in the door, Rosie saw Vivian reach across the small writing desk. Her fingers closed around a heavy silver letter opener, the kind used for estate correspondence, with a pointed tip and a weighted handle. She raised it, not to open a letter. Rosie did not think. Her body was already moving before her mind had finished processing the image. She shoved the door open with her shoulder, crossed the study in 3 heavy, lurching steps, and put herself between Vivian's descending arm and Dmitri's chest. The letter opener caught her across the left forearm and sliced up toward her shoulder. The pain was immediate and total, a bright, searing line from wrist to bicep. Rosie's momentum carried her into the edge of the desk. She grabbed it, kept herself upright, and stepped back to put her own body squarely in front of Dmitri. "Get away from him," Rosie said. Her voice was completely level. She didn't recognize it as her own. Vivienne stared at her. The letter opener was still in her hand, the tip dark with Rosie's blood. Her composure had cracked, replaced with something uglier beneath. "You absolute! What is happening in here?" The voice came from the doorway. It was not raised, it did not need to be. Mikhail Vasilyev stood in the frame, his jacket still on from the dinner, his grey eyes moving through the room with the speed and precision of someone trained to process a scene in fractions of a second. They moved from Vivienne's hand, the letter opener, to the blood running down Rosie's arm to his uncle, white-faced and trembling behind her. The room became very still. "Mikhail." Vivienne found her voice first, recalibrating visibly, smoothing her expression. "Your uncle is unwell." He became agitated, and there was an incident. The woman overreacted, and Mikhail crossed the room in silence. He didn't go to Vivienne. He went directly to Rosie. pulling the folded handkerchief from his breast pocket with the practiced economy of a man who had dealt with blood before. He took her arm carefully, his fingers pressing the cloth firmly against the cut, stanching the flow with steady, deliberate pressure. Rosie's legs, which had been holding her up through sheer determination, chose that moment to begin shaking. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "You're not," Mikhail said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Vivian. "Put that down." Vivian set the letter opener on the desk. Her chin was still elevated. "Uncle." Mikhail's voice changed when he addressed Dmitri. Something softer entered it, something that he clearly did not allow in other registers. He reached out and gripped the older man's shoulder. "Are you hurt?" Dmitri, who had been staring at Rosie with an expression of terrified gratitude, shook his head. "She stepped in front of me," he said. "Misha." "She stepped right in front of me." Mikhail's jaw moved, that small, barely visible muscle near his temple that Rosie had noticed before. He turned back to Vivian. "You're going to leave this room," he said. "You're going to collect your father. You're going to be out of this estate in the next 10 minutes. You can't be serious." Vivian's voice hardened. "My father and Victor are in the middle of a significant business agreement. You would throw that away over a cleaning woman." "The agreement is finished," Mikhail said. "It was not delivered with heat. It was delivered the way a person states a fact that has already happened and simply needs to be reported. Whatever my father decided tonight, I'm undeciding. Leave." Vivian stared at him for 3 long seconds. Then she looked at Rosie with an expression of pure, concentrated loathing. "You have no idea what you've cost yourself," she said. Rosie said nothing. Vivian left. One of Mikhail's security team materialized in the doorway within moments, and there was a brief, low exchange, after which Rosie heard the sound of heels on marble, moving away, fading, and then gone. Mikhail turned back to Rosie. The handkerchief was soaked through. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because the shock was starting to release its grip on her nervous system and the pain was becoming significantly more present, she added, "Maybe slowly." He made a call. The estate's private physician arrived in under 20 minutes. Rosie sat on the leather couch in the study, while the doctor cleaned and closed the wound with 8 stitches, Dmitri holding her free hand the entire time, and periodically telling the physician she was a very good girl who did not deserve any of this. Mikhail stood by the window with his back to her, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his phone. She could hear pieces of the calls he was making. They were short and precise. She couldn't make out the specifics, but the tone was the same one she associated with very large and permanent decisions. Later, she would understand exactly what those calls set in motion. The Hale family's import partnership, which had taken Victor 2 years to negotiate, was unwound in 72 hours. Conrad Hale's name disappeared from the pending contract. Vivian's access to the estate's social circles, carefully cultivated over 18 months of strategic friendships, was quietly and efficiently dismantled. Business introductions were rescinded. Invitations stopped arriving. The small, invisible infrastructure of patronage that the Hales had been building in Greenwich dissolved like sugar in rain. The Hales were not destroyed publicly. They were simply rendered irrelevant, which, in their world, was worse. None of that was Rosie's doing. All of it was done on her behalf. She didn't know the full scope of it until much later. What she knew, in the immediate aftermath, was that Dmitri refused to release her hand until the physician finished, and that when she finally tried to stand, Mikhail turned from the window and said, in the same flat, factual tone he used for everything, "You're staying in the guest suite tonight. Don't argue." She argued anyway, on principle and because the pain was making her slightly irrational. She pointed out that she lived 20 minutes away, that she had her car, that her brother would worry. Mikhail looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't read. Then he took her phone from the side table, unlocked it with a look, and texted Danny himself, from her contact, that she was staying with a client and would be home in the morning. He handed the phone back to her. "That's not," she started. "Your brother says okay and to bring him a snack," Mikhail said. She looked at the screen. Danny had sent back a thumbs up and a cookie emoji. She stayed in the guest suite. It had a bathrobe that cost more than her monthly rent and a view of the garden that looked like a painting. She lay on top of the covers in her uniform, arm throbbing, too wound up to sleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the night. Dmitri knocked on her door at 7 in the morning, with 2 cups of tea and a full and lucid apology that made her cry in a way the stitches had not. He sat at the edge of the armchair and held his teacup carefully and told her that he knew, on his clear days, what was happening to his mind. He told her that most of the people in his life treated the fog like a shameful secret to be managed. She, he said, treated it like weather, something that passed, something that didn't change who he was underneath. "I want you to know," he said, "that I understand exactly what you did last night. I was there. I understood it in the moment, and I understand it now. You put yourself in front of something that was meant for me. I just reacted," Rosie said. "No," Dmitri said gently. "You chose. There's a difference. People who just react run away." She was still thinking about that when Mikhail knocked an hour later. He came in without the jacket, which was somehow more unsettling. He looked less armored. He sat in the chair Dmitri had vacated and rested his forearms on his knees and looked at her bandaged arm with an expression that, for the first time since she'd known him, she could actually read. "My uncle told me what happened," he said, "before the part I walked in on." She wasn't going to just threaten him, Rosie said. The way she picked it up, she meant it. "I know." A pause. "You knew she meant it. That's why you moved." Rosie didn't answer. The morning light was coming through the garden window and it was making the room look warmer than it was. "I've been thinking," Mikhail said, "about what you've been doing for him. The medications. The evenings. My security team told me. They noticed things." Another pause. "I didn't know the extent of it." "He's kind to me," Rosie said simply, "and he doesn't need the whole house watching him fall apart." Something shifted in Mikhail's face. Not dramatic, just a softening around the jaw, a slight release of a tension that appeared to be his permanent baseline. "Your position here," he said carefully, "is being changed. You won't be on the cleaning rotation anymore. I'm asking you to consider something more specific, a role managing my uncle's daily care, coordinating with his physician, making sure the household accommodates what he needs without making him feel like a patient." He stopped. "I'm describing it badly." "No," Rosie said, "you're describing it correctly." He looked at her. "I know what the job is," she said. "I've been doing a version of it for 3 weeks for free." A pause. And then, barely, Mikhail Vasiliev almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but it came closer than she suspected it usually did. "The salary would be significant," he said. "Your brother's medical costs. I've already had them reviewed. They're manageable." Rosie went very still. "I don't need." "I know you don't need it," he said. "I'm not offering it because you need it. I'm offering it because it's fair, and because what you did last night cannot be compensated by any salary, and I'm aware of that. And this is the part I'm able to do." The morning light moved. The garden outside was very green. "There's something else," Mikhail said. He reached into his pocket and set a small evidence bag on the side table between them. Inside it was the letter opener. The physician found traces of a chemical compound on the tip. Fast-acting. Cardiac. It was already on the blade before she picked it up. Rosie looked at the bag. "She didn't grab it in anger," Mikhail said quietly. "She came into that room with it already prepared. The weight of that settled into the room like a change in pressure. Dmitri wasn't the original target," Mikhail continued. "He was an opportunity. The intended introduction was supposed to be a signing ceremony, with my father's fountain pen. The pen that sits on the desk in his office. The same pen he uses for every significant agreement. Victor. They had come for Victor. Your clumsiness," Mikhail said, and the word had no edge in it at all, "has been misdirecting attention for weeks. You are not clumsy, Rosie. You are exactly where you need to be. Doing exactly where you need to be. Doing exactly what needs to be done in a house full of people who stopped seeing clearly a long time ago." She didn't trust herself to speak. "The Hales are being handled," he said, "comprehensively. You don't need to worry about that." "I wasn't worried about that," she said honestly. He looked at her again with that recalibrating pause she recognized from the hallway on her first week. As if she kept presenting information he hadn't accounted for. "My uncle is very attached to you," he said. "I know." "He's not the only one," Mikhail said, and then, because he was apparently a man who expressed things once and did not repeat them, he stood, straightened his collar, and moved toward the door. "Mr. Vasiliev," Rosie said. He paused. "The suite," she said. "The bathrobe is very good." He stopped with his hand on the door, and this time the almost smile actually landed, brief, real, and entirely unguarded. "It's yours," he said. "The suite, for as long as you want it." He left. Rosie leaned back against the silk pillows and looked at the garden and thought about her grandmother, and about Dmitri, and about the particular quality of care that happens when someone decides another person's dignity is worth protecting, regardless of what it costs them. She had come to the Vasiliev estate for a paycheck. She had stayed without meaning to because an old man with fog in his mind had called her by the wrong name, and she hadn't corrected him. And somehow that small human decision had led her here, to stitches and morning tea, and a door that had been left slightly open. 3 months later, when the formal security review was complete and the Hale network had been fully dismantled, Mikhail came to find her in the solarium. She was sitting with Dmitri, both of them reading, the two ancient cats distributed across their laps with the boneless authority of cats everywhere. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Dmitri looked up and smiled with the particular satisfaction of a man who has understood something and watched it unfold exactly as expected. Mikhail sat down. Nobody spoke for a while. The afternoon light came through the glass walls in long, warm panels, and the cats purred, and Dmitri turned a page of his military history, and Rosie became slowly, quietly aware that she had stopped waiting to be asked to leave. The woman who had arrived at the service entrance of the Vasiliev estate with a cleaning caddy and a uniform, 2 sizes too small, had not left. She had simply, gradually, irreversibly become part of what the house was built to protect. I keep coming back to the moment Rosie didn't think. That's the part that stays with me. Not the stitches, not the letter opener, not the $8,000 suite she ended up sleeping in. The part where her body was already moving before her mind had finished processing what she was seeing, because that's not instinct. That's character. Character is just instinct that's been built quietly over years of choices nobody was watching. Rosie didn't walk into the Vasiliev estate looking to prove anything. She walked in needing insulin money and a steady paycheck. And yet from her very first week, before she had any reason to expect loyalty back, she was giving it. She learned Dmitri's fog without being asked. She covered for him without credit. She reorganized his medications, walked him back from the garden in the dark, called him by the right name when he came back to himself. Nobody assigned her that. Nobody was grading her on it. She just decided, privately, that his dignity was worth protecting. That decision, made in a dozen small moments nobody witnessed, is what put her in that study at exactly the right time. That's how I understand cause and effect when I look at this story. Not luck, not fate. The right person was in the right place because she had already been practicing, every single day, the exact qualities the moment required. What strikes me about Vivian is the contrast. She was intelligent, no question, calculated, patient, ruthless in the most organized way. She had mapped out a plan that could have worked. But intelligence without any genuine ethical center is just strategy, without a flaw. It collapses the moment it meets something it didn't account for. And what it didn't account for was a 26-year-old housekeeper who had decided, for no strategic reason at all, that an old man with fog in his mind deserved to feel safe in his own home. Rosie's moral clarity wasn't dramatic. She didn't deliver speeches about right and wrong. She just kept making the same small, unglamorous choice, over and over, to treat a vulnerable person with dignity when nobody required her to. That quiet consistency is what I find myself thinking about most. It is, I think, the hardest kind of good. The kind that happens in empty hallways at dusk. The kind with no audience. And then there's the persistence of it. Rosie had every reason to keep her head down, do the minimum, and protect herself. She was low on the hierarchy. She had been humiliated at the dinner table in front of a room full of powerful people. She was a woman who took up space in a world that preferred her invisible. She kept showing up anyway. She kept doing the work. The endurance wasn't loud, but it was total. What Mikhail recognized in the end wasn't just bravery. It was the specific weight of a person who has been quietly doing the right thing long enough that, when the real moment arrives, they don't have to decide. The decision is already made. It was made weeks ago, in a garden, in the dark, when nobody was watching. I think about that a lot. The life you build in the moments no one sees is the life that shows up when everything actually matters.